You know, sometimes you can find a building that you don't have to change, that it fits all your needs. Like for emergency aid, us being here, we have our office space, we have our warehouse facility where we can bring in the trucks and the food and stuff. So it's worked out immensely for that. Also, our clientele is all around this area. Our low-income housing is right along the street, as well as the bus line and things like that. So we haven't had to adapt the building, except we adapted to the building. So we can maintain the historical significance outside of the building and stuff, and still be very functional. I would like to point out that in Boulder City, Money Magazine made us one of the 25 cities to retire in. And the historical preservation, I think, has a lot to do with that. I'd also like to mention that our crime rate is 60-some% lower than the rest of the country. Now, I'm not saying that emergency aid, our police force, and I'm just saying that looking at the community as a whole, advancing the historical sense of it, and just supporting our community does so much for all of us. So, thank you.
Talking specifically about this building, years ago the city approached me and they wanted to put some community toilet rooms in the downtown area for people that are walking through, tourists and so forth. And this was the site they chose, and it really produced quite a challenge to put restrooms in here when the building is about 3 feet, almost 3 feet elevated off the street level. We chose that into the building because the sidewalk does slope up there, and I was able to put a ramp in that comes gently down from B, another ramp up this direction. We put a new door in there. I used the design of the overhead structure and the jambs from the front door here, so it looked just like the original, and introduced fixtures that they would have used during that period for light fixtures. And I think that if you didn't know that it had been added for next year, the goal was to make it look like it's always been there. Use the same type of twisted railings and so forth. So it's always a challenge, especially. And then when the restrooms, of course, are ADA, and that's another thing that we constantly face in reusing old buildings, is the challenges of access and then refitting the interior for the larger accessible restrooms and the larger, wider doorways. It's always a concern, and it's often hard to do in a compatible manner to the existing structures.
So thank you everyone for those great comments, and I think, so for some people, I think a lot of us here, in some ways we're preaching to the choir, get that idea that historic preservation has this, it's a balance between change and maintaining the historic integrity. But for some people might start to wonder, well, if there is that flexibility, what are we doing? What is historic preservation? And so I'll tell you that I jokingly call myself a building hugger. I think it's, I will often, extol the virtues of my favorite era of architecture, and, I think that I often worry that my love of mid-20th century architecture kind of distorts the view of what historic preservation often is, and so I've tried over the last couple of years to kind of dial that back a little bit. But there was a great piece that came out in Art Daily a few years ago. It's a great blog. It was a piece with the title, "Do Architectural Preservationists Know What They're Fighting For?" And emerged out of a debate over preserving postmodern architecture, which is going to be, as preservationists, our next battle. And I think it is going to be a much bigger battle than mid-20th century architecture was, the modernist movement. I think the TV show Mad Men was extremely helpful in explaining mid-century architecture to people. We kind of need a TV show taking place in the 80s to explain postmodern architecture, and I'll be honest, I need postmodern architecture explained to me some days too. But it was a really interesting piece because there are some very strong feelings out there about postmodern architecture and historic preservation. And so there's a couple of quotes that I just wanted to pose to the panel to get some of your thoughts on, because it really does got me to really think about what it means, what historic preservation is about. So the first quote is, whether a building is worthy to be saved, does not depend on anybody's personal experiences of that building or whether it is liked. In fact, it doesn't even depend on whether a building is any good, right? The building does not have to be good. That stopped me as I was reading that, right? Then the next part, in the field of history, it is now generally accepted that understanding our past is key to making better decisions in the future. While other events, periods, and people might be best remembered through documents, images, and trinkets, the best record of an architectural period is unquestionably the buildings that represent it. So if then architectural preservation is an act of recording history, what matters is not whether a given building is good, but rather whether it is important. And to me, that really changed a lot of the way that I thought about historic preservation, because I'm not a huge fan of postmodern buildings, but when they become historic, I will fight for them, right? It doesn't matter if they're a good piece of architecture, doesn't matter if you like it. This is all of our past recorded through buildings. So I'd really just like to kind of throw that to the panel and see what folks have to say.
I always have microphone issues apparently, but I just had a thought. I'm sure Roger would echo me on this because most of my ideas come from him, but I was thinking this as we were talking about the previous question as well, that Boulder City needs to decide what its narrative is. I think most of us know what that narrative is, and then we need to select which buildings tell that narrative the best and decide that those are the ones worth going after and saving. And I'm not sure an agreement has ever been made on that. As a museum, we know some that we identify as very important to our narrative, this being one of them, and we chose to have this as one of the main stops on our walking tour because the entry does tell an Art Deco, a very deliberate architecture that happened with the 1930s to bring the mentality from a very depressed state, having gone through the Depression and the Dust Bowl and World War I. All of those people had faced those things, and they started to build buildings that showed power and strength to overcome those problems. The design of the dam was very deliberate. They took away the gargoyles that were originally supposed to be on top of it, and they replaced it with strength and stainless steel and terrazzo floors. And you see that in the entry of this building as well with the tile work and the LA Water and Power logo that's in the center of the room. This tells our narrative, and we had some problems that Alan Stromberg, we wanted to make this an exhibit. We wanted to sort of bring the museum out into the community in creating the walking tour, and this doesn't have wheelchair access into that room. And we had to put these gates in. We chose an Art Deco motif. The museum did the gates that you see in the entry so that people could come and see the exhibit but not access the rest of the building, so emergency aid would be protected. But those stairs are very historic. They have their own narrative. They're made out of a stone that we can't find anymore. We don't want to ruin those stairs, but making them wheelchair accessible, so we had to put a handicapped access to the exhibit outside and an additional one inside so that everybody could experience it as much as possible. But anyway, I think that's Boulder City's challenge, is to come up with identify the narrative, come up with the buildings that tell that narrative, and then work with a way to preserve those buildings.
I mean, that's a really, really important point. But something that you have to keep in mind, I think, is that a town may have more than one narrative that are very important. And certainly the original narrative of Boulder City is the construction of Hoover Dam and the workers' cottages down along the avenues and so on. But there's another part of Boulder City that speaks to a very important historical narrative in the country, and that's the post-war boom. And all those little motels along the street, along the, was it Boulder City Parkway now, whatever they call it this week. Those are very, very significant buildings. I mean, they look pretty awful right now. But if you're familiar at all with what they've done in Palm Springs, for instance, with those mid-century modern motels, those drive-in motels, those have become a huge draw for that city, and people love that stuff, and they want to stay in one of these places. And Boulder City has 5 or 6 of them sitting right there just waiting to be preserved, adapted, and made to best represent that narrative of this town.
I'm going to get back to the comment about a building doesn't have to be good. You know, if you come to the museum, you see the Babcock and, well, not Babcock and Wilk House, it's fine. But if you see the Giles Barkas house, this is not much of a house. You know, if you see the Grand Canyon Airlines ticketing office, it's a shack. They're not great buildings. They're not architectural wonders by any means. They've got very important histories, and they're ones that help us tell the narrative that we're telling as an institution. Now, that's a different thing than looking at individual structures that you might own or you might look at and say that needs to be preserved. And you're right. I mean, we look at structures, look at a lot of industrial structures. Look at the structures around a mining camp. Those are not pretty buildings. They were not meant to be pretty. They were meant to be used. They're hammered up. They're torn down. They're modified. You know, buildings on ranches and that, they didn't stay the same. They were built to be used. But sometimes those are the ones that you have to hang on to somehow in order to have that part of your heritage still be out there. So there are times when we're going to be looking at buildings, and I've seen that in some of the arguments over some of the brutalist architecture.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I don't have that. Yes. But I mean, you're talking about an architecture that's not really easy to love, and it wasn't meant to be, you know. But I mean, we also live in the desert. It's not always easy to love, you know. But still, in order to have our heritage out there, doesn't mean you save everything. That's always one of the problems. When people want to save everything, you can't do that. You know, it's got to make some sense economically. When you get down to the bottom line, the only reason that the county museum has the structures they have is because the people of Clark County, you included, pay your taxes. That's what keeps that place open. We don't make it on $2 a head coming through the front door. But, what's that?
$1 for seniors.
$1 for seniors, yes, if you're over 55 like I am, or under 18, then it's $1. But really, you know, we've got that as a funding source. You know, all of us, I know that Roger deals with this all the time, and as do you with, you know, how do you fund an historic structure? I mean, it's not easy. And when you start looking at buildings, having good adaptive reuses, like you were talking about with Forge and that building wouldn't exist otherwise, because there's no way to make sure it's there. You have to make sure that as you're looking at what you want to preserve, you are thinking about how are you going to do it. It's easy, and relatively speaking, it's easy to get money to preserve something, to save it, to rebuild it. It's really hard to pay the electric bill. Nobody wants to give you money for that. The water bill, the sewer bill, yeah, there's one you want to go right, you know, having a big fundraiser for. Yeah, we're having wine and cheese to pay the sewer bill this week. Yeah, I don't think that's going to work for you. So you need to always, you know, yes, you're going to have structures that are not pretty and ones that still need to be preserved, but make sure that you always keep in mind that bottom line that, unfortunately, it's about the money. That's going to eventually come back and bite you if you don't plan for it up front.
I just want to say we have a
sewer pipe out front if you want to drop a couple dollars in on your way out to help us pay our sewer bill. We appreciate it. You know, I'll try to do this briefly. Leslie and Cheryl have heard this too many times, but one of the things I was able to bring with me when I came here that I think has helped me contribute was my knowledge that I got from living in one of the small steel towns along the Steel Valley between Pittsburgh and Cleveland. And in the 1970s, when the steel mills crashed, there were 40 or so little towns along the rivers and railroads between those two cities, once great cities, one of which still is, but and confronted with serious economic problems. And if you go through there now, if there's 40, you'll find 34 of them that are pretty much in squalor and probably not safe to go through. I know they're not safe. And you'll find 6 or 7 treasures. 6 or 7 communities that faced the same exact thing, that looked exactly the same in 1970. Some of them are across the river or across the railroad tracks from the others. And what was the difference? What happened in those now healthy cities that didn't happen in the other cities? And they all began to look at, you know, their history or what's special about our town that we can attract people in here and things. But the ones that worked were the ones that were able to form an alliance of all the interested parties that behaved, that talked to each other with candor, that made the kind of decisions about, you know, would take Dennis's input about the hotels there, which, you know, I agree with like 100%, but that would become a part of the discussion. And someone that maybe didn't necessarily value those hotels like they valued the Avenue houses or something, could speak with candor, and those issues could be laid out on the table. And then, because listen, history that didn't only happen in the past. Central to your question, history happens every day. What we decide is important, that's how history is written. And if you go into classrooms, your history classrooms, your 11th grade history class today, it will be different than the 11th grade history you learned. The history didn't change, but the way it's perceived is different. And so history is always changing, and the people of the present have an obligation to contribute to the history of the past and to decide what's important about that, what we're going to remember, how we're going to process it. That's our obligation. It's such a big obligation that it can't fall on anyone. It can't fall on the city of Boulder City to do that. It can't fall on the Boulder City Hoover Dam Museum to do that, or the Historic Preservation Committee, or the Arts and History Council in this town. It requires an alliance, and it requires an alliance that's dictated by candor, where people can discuss honestly, that real issues can take surface, and that people are willing to make compromises. And then you come out of it and you say, okay, we know that we didn't hit everything, but this is what we decided together, candidly, what's important. And if you go look at those little towns, Chagrin Falls, Ohio, Beaver, Pennsylvania, that are thriving today, you will find that in their history. You will find that event in their history.
We'll be trying again this session, and so I would love anyone and everyone to come and testify in support of my bill. I will let you all know and keep you in the loop. Session doesn't start until January of next year, but this is something that our towns and our older buildings really need. So with that, I will open it up to questions. If folks just want to raise their hands, and I'll kind of call on people. I think it's going to be hard to pass the microphone around, so maybe just use your teacher voice. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, go ahead, feel free.
Specific panelist?
Either way, either specific panelist or to the entire panel. Your choice.
Well, to 2 speakers, and I have to pick specifically to, I don't know your name, is it Mr. Hall, Pat, or Mark, and Mrs. Woodbury. I've heard the saying, we can't save every building. And you haven't said what specifically you mean by that. It's almost become a mantra in Boulder City relating to the historic district. So I would need to know what specifically is being said. Historic preservation in Boulder City is going to become incredibly important as soon as the bypass opens. Our history and what we're offering to tourists are a state of mind, historic buildings, and an ambiance. And if you could tell me which historic buildings aren't important, and you want to, you're not going to put money into those that are going to be torn down or lost, I don't know if you're saying that and you haven't made that clear. The two examples that come to mind are the filtration plant and the hangar. The city council just tried to sell those, and with public outcry, they backed down. This building has deferred maintenance. The filtration plant, the roof has leaked horribly for years and years. The city hasn't put any money into it. The hangar was claimed to be a tear down in a recent appraisal, but we're getting $8,000 a month, and there was a very low appraisal and a quick attempt to sell it, and luckily, by public outcry, those things have been backed off of. So I would like to hear what specifically you're talking about in terms of when you say we can't save every building, do you have buildings in mind? Because together collectively, Boulder City doesn't have any buildings to spare. And if we don't get creative and do something with the filtration plant and the downtown, we aren't going to have the draw that we need. So I'd like to hear what specifically we can sacrifice.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start off there and say that I think it's probably not possible for any individual up here to give a list of buildings that should be saved and should not be saved.
I'm not sure if the city of Boulder City has done this yet, but I know one of the things that we're currently doing in Gerlach, Nevada, is we are doing a reconnaissance level survey of historic buildings in order to provide an analysis of what buildings that are, we're kind of roughly going with the 50-year mark. We're actually going into the mid-70s just to provide a little more longevity for that study. But to provide the city with an analysis, a building by building analysis, to determine which ones are significant. Because as we know, it isn't necessarily the age of the building that makes it important, it's the story that's with it too. So I would say that it's probably gonna be very difficult to list out buildings that should be demolished at this point or could be demolished. I think there's a long analysis that has to happen, and I would really encourage the Boulder City hire an organization to do a reconnaissance level survey, a windshield survey, just to get a better idea, kind of get your arms around what you have so that some decisions can be made going forward.
Well, I think, nobody at this point is going to sit down and write a list. We're going to demolish this building, save this one, and this one, and this one, and so on. But Neil makes a very, very good point, and that's why this moment in Boulder City's history of historic preservation, or lack of it, is so very important. Because I feel I've seen the attitude changing, and I have to go back to what Leslie said. You have to have a narrative first, or two narratives, or whatever. You have to decide what you are, who you are, before you can approach historic preservation, because the point of historic preservation is to maintain an identity and a community, and if you don't know what you are and where you came from, you're not going to be able to do any viable historic preservation. And that's been the problem, I feel, in Boulder City as long as I've been alive, which is a very long time, is that they've approached this without a coherent narrative or sense of what they are and what they want to become. I think in part the bypass is forcing that question on the town, and so far I've seen that some nice glimmers that it's being approached in a serious way that might work out. So Neil's point is well taken, and so is Leslie's, but this has to be established first before we can decide what's going to happen and what's not.
So first, to the first part of it, we can't save everything simply because we don't have the resources. When you start looking at buildings and you figure that every building that we have there has to have a roof on it, and that roof has to be replaced every 25 or 30 years, and window frames here where it's masonry buildings, they have to be painted. And all of these things have costs. So to that, we can partially solve that through understanding that they don't have to be preserved as historic buildings, they get to be preserved as an old house that somebody lives in. So we have a resource issue. And it's bigger on things like the hangar and on the water treatment building, which don't have yet a viable use that can produce enough income to care for them. The second piece though, but to support some of your comments, one of the things that makes this town so spectacular is the continuity of all the buildings. The fact as you come up Nevada Way, you do see the rundown but intact mid-century hotels, and you see the cottages that surround us. And they speak to a time, and it's a consistent time. And if we knock down one of them and put up a 80s modern building in the midst of the 30s modern houses, it wouldn't work. So we have this community where things very much work together as a single story, and we haven't lost that yet. And that's one of those things that the community has to support internally. And by the way, in historic preservation, if we were to go and take one of these houses and nominate it for the National Register and it got put on the National Register, there'd be nothing to say the owner couldn't knock it down. There's nothing absolutely preserving these buildings except the community as a whole and its pressure to maintain them.
I also wanted to say again, Neil, that you've made another very good point. Boulder City's visual identity, which is the streetscapes, the buildings, is very small. And so you have to keep in mind that if you tear one or two things down, it's going to make a far more significant difference in the visual identity than if you tore it down in Henderson or Las Vegas.
They've done it in Henderson.
And so
No, I mean, and that's a good point. You look at downtown Henderson. Henderson had a downtown, and it was built at a very small period in time, in the early 1940s during the war. And if there was a national symbol of the origins of Henderson, it would be the cinder block, because that's what they built everything out of. But they have gotten rid of all of those, and so you have a real problem there. You have the townsite houses there that thankfully a number of those still exist, but it's a good counterpoint to what you're looking at here. But to say, which ones are you going to save, which ones are you not going to save? No, you can't do that unless you've done the survey. I mean, the worst thing in the world is to react at the last minute, I think, of your hospital recently, and try to do something when the decisions have been made and all of this has come about, whether or not it was done in the middle of the night in a smoke-filled room or whatever. But that doesn't work. You've got to plan ahead of time. So yes, you need the narrative, but you've got to have the data. You've got to have the surveys. You have to know what you have. What buildings are out there. There's some little buildings out there that are quite early. Alan and I talked to the owner of one of them down on Boulder Highway here. Carol, is it? Okay. That, she loves her little building there, and it's a very early structure as part of the Union Oil area there. And she loves that little building. Is it part of your history? Yeah, it is. It's a nice early one too. But you need to have that, and you don't want to find that out 2 days after the bulldozers have left the field. Because that also just happened last year? Yeah, last year in Henderson when they tore down Jim Thorpe's bar. It's gone. And it was gone overnight. So you need to know this and make sure that your city, you're working with your city, and you're making sure that they're not putting out the demolition permits that you need, that somebody wants right now, because once the permit is issued, it's real hard to take that thing back. And most people that are demolishing something, they want the bulldozers there now.
I'm not really part of the panel, but I figure we get one commercial right. Just to let you know what the city and the committee has been doing lately is like one of the things you'll see up here is proposed Bullet Field Historic District, which would be the first new historic district in Boulder City since 1983, the Jansch report. So that's been gone through the Planning Commission, but one of the things the committee has put as its priorities this year is to get a CLG designation, which is a certified legacy.
Certified local government.
Yeah, so certified local government. It's basically, we are looking at getting survey, once we qualify for this with SHPO, there is, there's talk here about creating a new historic district along Nevada Highway, or whatever we're calling it this week, as Dennis said. But there are interests in there, and I think it's one of the things that we'd love to have, at the Historic Preservation Committee, is that your input and support, because we'd like to expand our historic district, but the first thing we have to do is to figure out what we have. And the inventory, what they're talking about, is crucial for that first step, is the rigor. Let's find out what we have before we lose it. Thank you.
I just want to say that I love Heidi's idea so much that we've been suggesting it to the council for about 2 years now, to identify what structures are important. I think a study like this does need to be done. I think that will happen. I think the city is moving in that direction. And also, just to point out, there are many, many different ways to preserve our buildings in Boulder City. The government will not be able to do them all. And that the Boulder Down Hotel is a perfect example of something with private ownership. It is a nonprofit organization that the government happens to help with somewhat through small grants, but they don't maintain it. If they did maintain it, it would cost them about $600,000 a year to do what we do. We do it for far less of a cost to them. And so I think we can look at partnerships. I think that there's lots of different ways to preserve history. And some will include the city being heavily involved, hopefully. So.
Thanks. So I just wanted to return, make one comment following what Mark said too, is that not only when you are advocating for a building do you need to start really early, but you need to know where your fight actually lies. I know that we were helping some folks up north who just lost several buildings, and they had been asking their city council to not allow the demolition, only to learn that that city process, demolition orders are staff approvals, and the city council would probably never intervene. So the issue was not to go to the city council, the Historic Preservation Commission. It was to find a change in ordinance so that demolitions are not necessarily staff approvals. And actually it's something that now, after that conversation with those folks, that we just ran into in Las Vegas. So if you know the Denny's that's on Las Vegas Boulevard near, it's on like this little pie wedge of Main Street of Las Vegas Boulevard, we are going to lose that. And sadly, they're going to tear down a mid-20th century building to rebuild a retro building that looks like it's kind of mid-century. So it is what it is, but we did learn through that process, because when we heard about that, we realized that Las Vegas has the same issue, that demolitions are staff approvals. That means if you meet the certain requirements, staff have to say yes. And so we now know that where our fight is, right? So we need to start talking to city council and figure out if there's any wiggle room, not for this building. This building is done, right? We need to look further ahead. We need to think what's gonna happen 5 years down the road. And I think that goes back to what Mark was saying, is that we can't, as historic preservationists, because we're really starting to get this head of steam, I feel like, in Nevada, we're going to lose some things in the front, but we can't get too fixated on what's right in front of us, because then we'll always be looking at what's right in front of us. We won't be looking at those fixes that take longer, and in the future will mean that we will be more successful. But it's still just starting to really, we're all kind of starting to get together and get ahead of steam, but it will mean that there will be losses. So with that, we have been up here for over an hour and a half, and so I would like to release the fabulous panel. If everybody could please give them a thank you. And thank you so much for coming. It was really enjoyable. Thank you.